What's up, guys? Welcome to the Fantasy Addiction Network. Today we are talking XFL Fantasy Football League. Let's get right into it. So what's up, guys? I'm super excited today to bring you this video. Today we are talking the brand new football league that's coming out here the week after the Super Bowl, the XFL Returns. And we finally get to see if the new rule changes and everything that they've done to try to get this league going if this league can actually turn into a developmental league for the NFL and really just be something to help tide over the off season between the end of the Super Bowl and then the beginning of the preseason for the NFL. But with all that being said, there's fantasy to be had, there's football to be played, and that means that there's analysis that needs to be done. So that's what we're doing here today, but really looking at what are the things that we can actually see with the new rule changes. How is this going to impact from a fantasy perspective? Because the game, while still football, is actually pretty different, and that's going to affect the way that we look at draft strategy and daily fantasy. Just understanding the rules is really going to help drive down and get to the bottom of where we need to be able to make smart choices in the XFL for fantasy purposes. So let's first look at some of the new rule changes. The XFL finally released their rules about a week ago. We've been diving into that, and now we can really just see what some of the changes are. So they've changed a lot to the kickoffs as one of the big changes that they've made. Players line up, I believe, on the 30 and the 35 yard line, and they can't move. The kicker will basically kick the ball, and they can't move until the person receiving the ball actually catches it, or the ball is rolling around on the ground for 3 seconds, and that's when players can actually move. So what they're trying to institute here is, one, not have as many full speed collisions between players basically running at each other at full speed, but also to encourage the potential for kickoffs to be returned. So from a fantasy perspective, that's going to be huge, especially if your settings that you set in your league allow for players to receive points for kickoff return touchdowns. There should be far more kickoff touchdowns in this league. And really, you'll start to notice a trend. A lot of the rule changes in this league are really designed to do two things. One, encourage more scoring, and two, increase the pace of play, and really just shorten the game because of that. They're trying to make sure these games end up being like 2.5 hours versus 3. Again, really just trying to change a lot of the things that they feel that the NFL isn't doing appropriately. And I think it should be a very interesting spin. We'll definitely have to do some analysis after we've seen some gameplay to see if it's actually working the way that they've intended, but it's pretty cool that they're at least trying to do something new and not just carbon copy the NFL. Because I mean, they really have to, considering the talent level of players that they have. They're going to have to do something to change and just make the game more interesting. So another really interesting rule change that will definitely impact fantasy, they have a double forward pass rule. So in the NFL, if once you have a forward pass, you cannot throw the ball forward anymore. While in the XFL, if you throw a pass that is still behind the line of scrimmage, even if it's a forward pass, you can then throw it again. So if you think of like your typical flea flicker, you can actually do a flea flicker now where you throw the ball forward after you roll out and then throw it from there. As long as the passer is behind the line of scrimmage, you can throw again. So what this means is there's going to be a few teams that will possibly have two relevant fantasy quarterbacks that they run two quarterback formations in, and also you'll see a decent amount of trick plays for any skill position player that can also throw the ball. You're going to see quite a few times that they'll have a forward pass. And that also means you'll probably see some plays where the running back will get the ball and then pass it forward to the quarterback, who will then turn it into a pass play from there. So it's just going to make things a bit more interesting for defenses to try to have to stop, which again should encourage more production and more scoring on the offense, which again is really the goal here. But that should mean that there's more fantasy points to be scored and potentially more fantasy relevant players. Also makes the quarterback position really interesting in this league. Another one of the big rules that are different from the NFL is there are no kicks for extra points. This is similar to the rule that they had previously. So they simplified it a lot since the last time that the XFL was around. So there's 3 options you get for extra points. You can either go for it on the 2 yard line, and that's worth 1 point. You can go for it on the 5 yard line, that's worth 2 points. or you can back up all the way to the 10 and go for it, and then that's worth 3 points. So they're basically trying to make it so that way it's easier to close a gap towards the end of the game. If you need a lot of points, you can risk it and go for bigger plays and try to catch up quicker, being able to score more points on each drive. From a fantasy perspective, most leagues are probably going to award players the same amount of points that they earn as the extra point. So like if a quarterback throws a 3-point conversion, the quarterback will get 3 extra points, and that's pretty huge because that's about half of the points of a touchdown, or even more if you're playing a 4-point league. So this is definitely going to impact how fantasy players, which ones are relevant. This is definitely going to boost your more red zone relevant running backs, tight ends, receivers, because they're going to have more opportunities each week to score like massive bonuses to points, because typically players that receive 1 point per 10 yards, well, now if they could get a 2-point conversion on top of the fact that they may have already just scored the touchdown, you're talking about potentially getting 8 or 9 point swings just from the touchdown and 2 or 3 point conversion. That's definitely going to lead to a lot higher scoring for fantasy, which makes the big play and big red zone receivers and tight ends far more valuable in this league. So that'll definitely go into our analysis for rankings. Punt rule is also similar to kick rules. They're trying to encourage more run backs and hopefully less injuries on return. So if a punter punts the ball out of bounds or into the end zone, it doesn't touch back. They don't get a touchback at the 20. They actually push them all the way up to the 35. So basically they're trying to encourage teams to not kick the ball because they want them to go for it on 4th down more often. And if they kick the ball out of bounds, they're going to start on the 35. So that means there's less distance to cover. The other thing is if they kick it inside, the punting team actually isn't allowed to cross the line of scrimmage until the receiver on the on the defensive side catches the ball. That's when the players can actually start running down the field, meaning there's going to be a lot more space for the punt returner to run and gain some more yards. So again, they're really just trying to push teams to go for it on 4th down. I'm not sure that this is going to be the effect that they get. If the first week there's a lot of punt return touchdowns, I think teams are just going to punt it out of bounds and just say, I have fine, put it on the 35-yard line. I don't want to risk having a punt return all the way for the touchdown if I can't actually have my guys go down and try to tackle him as soon as he catches the ball. So be interesting to see how this rule turns out, but that's how I foresee it going down, but we'll see how it goes. But again, for players that are punt returners, that's also going to boost their fantasy value, especially if you play in a league, which you should. I'm thinking for this league, it's going to make a lot more sense for you to award touchdowns for kick and punt returns, because they're making a lot of rule changes to increase the number of touchdowns, and with that they're trying to increase the number of kick return touchdowns. So it only makes sense from a fantasy perspective is if you get rewarded for that if you own that player. So there's also a change to like the overtime rule. They're trying to kind of be emblematic of the way that they do penalty kicks in soccer, to where both teams will line up on the 5-yard line and they get one play to throw it into the end zone. If they score, that's basically a point. If they don't, then they lose it, and it's 5 rounds just like you would have in a soccer game for penalty kicks. And they'll basically follow the same rules. If at the end of 5 rounds they're tied, they just go into sudden death until one team scores and one team doesn't. Again, just like in soccer. So what I'm really hoping for in the fantasy leagues that come out, that we actually have the option to turn off overtime scoring, because this could get incredibly excessive real quick, especially if players are scoring. I'd imagine you probably have to limit it to about 1 or 2 points for each overtime conversion, and then it wouldn't be as excessive. But if you had like 10 rounds where you went back and forth, that could be incredibly game changing and game breaking. So I'm hoping that you can actually just turn off the ability to score fantasy points in overtimes, because you can't predict when a team is going to go into overtime. But we'll see more. Again, right now we're still kind of dealing with lack of information over what the fantasy platforms are going to look like, so we'll keep you guys posted as that comes out. Some other quick rule changes, again, to just like keep the gameplay going. There's a 25-second play clock after the ball is spotted, not 40, and they also have like a designated referee to help spot the ball quicker. Again, this is all just to encourage pace of play and make sure that the games don't go as long. It might just end up meaning that more players get tired out, which would also mean that you'll probably see more cycling in and out of second and third string running backs and receivers, which might make it harder for fantasy, but we'll have to see how that actually plays out. They also only allow 2 timeouts per half. There's no coaches challenges. Everything is a official replay review by initiated by the officials, and they've also relaxed the catch rules, which I'm actually pretty excited about. Watching the AAF last year, you can definitely tell there's going to be a skill gap, complete difference between the players in the XFL and the NFL, because a lot of the players in the XFL are ex-NFL players that either had a bad run of injury luck, or they didn't get noticed in college, or they just didn't do well in the combine and they never got drafted, or they just played in the NFL and they weren't good enough to stay on a team. So there's definitely going to be a talent skill gap between the NFL and the XFL. So finding ways to make sure that big plays can still happen without requiring the same talent level is a really smart idea on the side of the XFL, in my opinion. So the rule that they're changing here is you only need 1 foot down in bounds to make a catch, meaning you don't have to do like your standard 2 feet or a foot in a butt cheek or whatever you have to get in the NFL. Basically, they're relaxing the catch rules. You still have to maintain possession of it going to the ground, but once you have possession of it, as long as there's a body part in bounds, it's a catch, and that's that. So that again should encourage more fantasy scoring, because a lot of catches in the NFL that would be incomplete in the XFL would be complete, which means more fantasy points. So that's pretty much it, at least as far as rules are concerned, that will impact fantasy. Again, there's other rules to affect the pace of play to make these games go quicker, and I think that'll be refreshing and relieving from watching an entire NFL game that can be incredibly long. It's nice to know that they're trying to keep this shorter, keep fans more engaged. Again, we'll see how it actually pans out here in a few weeks. But looking at all that, taking all these rule changes into consideration, what does that mean from a league settings perspective? How should that impact how our leagues are set up? Well, and first and foremost, I know a lot of people are looking for platforms in which to actually have an XFL league. About a week ago, the commissioner, Oliver Luck, has confirmed that they will have a fantasy platform before the season. Now, I know we're only about 3-4 weeks out from the start of the XFL season, so it's getting a little close here. So hopefully we'll have some news on that here pretty soon. But Oliver Luck said that there will be a fantasy component, and I mean, from a business perspective, if they don't have a fantasy component, that's just a big blunder on their part because of how big the fantasy industry is for the NFL. It would be incredibly important, in my opinion, for the XFL to make sure that they have a fantasy and a gambling component into this league if they want to make sure that it's successful. So I'm going to take Oliver Luck's word for it that there will be fantasy platforms released. Right now there is a site, it's called altfootballleague.com, that actually has a setup for the XFL, but it's really bare bones right now. You have very few customization options, and a lot of the players that are on teams right now aren't there. I'm thinking they're probably just working to get that website updated closer to when the season starts. So again, we'll keep an eye on that and make sure that once it's ready to go, if that's the only option, we'll be pumping that as the only option so that way you guys can play fantasy in the XFL. But we'll see over the course of the next couple weeks what comes down the pipeline in ways of different platforms. The XFL has some sponsorships with ESPN, so I could definitely see ESPN taking a stab at releasing it. And the other thing is too, they just released all these rule updates that are different than the NFL. They just released that last week. So that's probably a big reason as to why they have not released a fantasy platform yet, because of the rule changes not being released until now. I mean, you can't really set up a fantasy platform if you don't know how points are going to be scored. But now that that's out there, hopefully they have a quick plan of action to get that get a fantasy platform up and going, so that way we can actually play fantasy. But assuming that we'll have the normal fantasy platforms, and there's also going to be DraftKings and FanDuel have confirmed they're going to have daily contests. So we already know that they're on board with being able to have that component of fantasy. So that's going to be huge for the XFL to grow, and I'm really hoping that they get the season-long stuff announced pretty soon too. But we'll be doing some analysis, at least as far as daily is concerned. But again, for a season-long platform, let's discuss some of the rules that I would imagine will be the most optimum setups for XFL leagues going into this inaugural season. So first setting to discuss is league size. Now, typically in a NFL fantasy league, you're looking ideally about 12 teams, sometimes 10, 14, even 8. Like all across the board, those are normally fine, but 12 seems to be the sweet spot. Well, if you consider that 12 teams compared to 32 NFL teams, that means there's a decent amount of variety that you can have between the different teams. Well, in the XFL, there are only 8 teams. So considering the fact that there are only 8 teams, you really can't have 8 teams in your fantasy league or any more than that, because then you're going to run out of fantasy eligible players, and you basically have people playing with inactive or ineligible rosters unless you don't have onesie positions like the quarterback, the tight end, and the defense. Because I mean, if defense right there there's only 8 of them. So if you have more than 8 teams, that means that any team that doesn't draft a defense before the first 8 are gone, they don't have a defense for the rest of the year. So really what that means is, from a league size perspective, at least in this first year, you're looking at either 4 or 6. I'm going to contend that 6 is the better option, is the more competitive option, but I think 4 would still be acceptable. I just think from a league long, since it's a 10-week season, you're going to be playing the same players over and over again. It's going to be more exciting and impactful if you have 6 teams versus 4. But overall, do what is your preference. I'm moving forward with 6 as the best option. I'll explain why kind of as we go, but also give you guys some ideas if you want to do a 4-team league, what settings you can have. So again, assuming a 6-team league, a lineup setting is most likely going to be most optimal if you set it up with 1 quarterback, only 1 running back, 2 wide receivers, a flex spot, a tight end, and a defense. Now the reason I say only 1 running back is, again, you only have 8 teams. If you have 6 players in your fantasy league and everyone has to draft 2 running backs, well, already right there, that means you're forcing players to start 12 running backs from 8 teams. You could argue that ends up, making it more interesting, but really it just forces you into having to start backups or, running backs that aren't guaranteed any volume, which just adds more volatility and takes away from the fun of it. So in my opinion, I think it makes more sense to have one running back required, and then you have that flex spot. So if you draft 2 strong running backs, or you draft a running back and then you pick up a running back off of the waiver wire, you can still flex that second running back, but you're not required to do so. Also, this league, a lot of the settings that they've changed have really tried to tweak the league to be more centered around passing the ball, which doesn't necessarily take running backs out of the game, but it will definitely restrict it to more of your pass catching running backs rather than your power running backs. And that also is part of the reason why I think it makes sense, especially in a 6-team league, to have only 1 running back as your main starter. Now, if you're in a 4-team league, I take that back. I think you have to have 2 running backs start, because at that point it just becomes too easy to find the best receivers and just get 1 running back to get it done for you each week. But if you're in a 6-team league, you're going to want to bring it down to 1 running back and make sure you have that flex spot to still give you some flexibility and options. The wide receivers are going to be the most fun position to figure out week in and week out, but really from like a draft perspective, that's going to make the quarterback and the tight end very interesting, because you're going to want to make sure that you lock down someone solid that you can start every week, because there's not going to be many options for you on the waiver wire. But really considering that, so if we have a 6-team league, bench spots, that's one other thing I didn't mention. So in a 6-team league, you're really not going to want to exceed 3 bench spots. Now, I know that seems really shallow, and it is, but there aren't any bye weeks in this league. It's only 10 weeks long, and barring injuries, which I'm sure will happen, that would be the only real reason that you're really using those bench spots. But by having less bench spots when injuries happen, that means that the waiver wire will at least have something for players to pick up. You can increase that if you want, but the way that I did the math is, if you're looking at that lineup setting with 3 bench spots, that means that each team will have 10 players on their team, which means 60. So if you assume 1 fantasy relevant quarterback, 2 fantasy relevant running backs, 3 wide receivers, 1 tight end, and 1 defense for each team in the XFL, that would mean that there's only 64 players that would are quote unquote fantasy relevant, which obviously changes as injuries happen. But if you have 60 players that are drafted, that would mean only 4 relevant players would start off on the waiver wire. And then of course more would come down the line as injuries and changes in player personnel happen. So if you go any more than that, you're basically forcing players to draft second and third string guys that probably won't even see the field for the first couple of weeks, which maybe there's, if you enjoy having deep leagues without any waivers and you want it to be like a trade heavy league, then you could increase the bench spots. But for me, I think the ideal spot is going to be 3 bench slots with the lineup settings the way that we had. So that way there's at least some action on the waiver wire each week. If you do decide to go with 4 teams, you can probably up the bench spots to 4. There will still be more players on the waiver wire than your typical 16 league would be, so it makes more sense to be able to have a little bit more strategy in your lineup setting each week by giving you a little bit more flexibility in your bench. All right, so with the league settings and the roster lineups set up, let's kind of talk about the point settings. You don't really need to change too much in terms of like your yardage and your touchdown settings from your traditional NFL league. I think 1 point per 10 yards for the running backs and wide receivers makes the most sense. And then quarterbacks, you can either do 1 point per 20 or 1 point per 25 yards. Again, whatever your preference is. And then same thing with touchdowns. Running backs, wide receivers, tight ends should get 6 points for a touchdown. Quarterbacks can either get 4 or 6. In this league, I'm not really sure how many rushing touchdowns there's going to be. There's a few, run-heavy quarterbacks that would probably receive a pretty big advantage if you jumped, from 4 to 6 points for a rushing touchdown versus a passing touchdown. My preference is to just put 6 points for a touchdown across the board. Then it just evens the playing field, for whatever style of quarterback that you have. And then same thing, you can either choose to do a point per reception league, half point per reception, or like your standard no point per reception league. I like PPR. That's the style that I typically gravitate to, and I think in this league that's going to encourage a lot more passing. And considering the overall lack of depth that you're going to have on your team, having PPR is going to make more of those, third down running back type guys way more relevant, or the slot receiver that only gets 30-40 yards but gets 5 or 6 catches each week. It makes more players relevant, and in a league where you don't have a lot of potential players for your fantasy team, I think you want as many fantasy relevant players as possible. So I think PPR is going to be the ideal setting in this league. So with the change in the extra points, obviously that will, impact the way that you want to set up your scoring. Again, I think the way that it's going to be standard and the way that I would approve of it too is if you have a quarterback throws to a running back and they score a 1 point conversion, both players get 1 point. If it was a 2 point conversion, 2 points, so on and so forth. I think that makes a lot of sense and also increases like the impact of those scoring plays. And it also gives you like a little bonus if a player runs a kickback and you didn't get a chance for your quarterback to score. Well, he still gets a chance to score on the try after the touchdown. So it keeps the game relevant for fantasy players as you go on. You might notice I haven't talked about kickers. I hate kickers in the NFL, and I think they'll be even more irrelevant in the XFL. There's no extra points with the rules surrounding the punts. There's going to be less kicks. Teams are already going to be more inclined to go for it on 4th down. You can score more points on touchdowns with the extra point rule. I really just don't see many field goals being kicked in this league. And just considering the overall lack of talent in the kicker position in this league, I think you're going to find that kickers are just incredibly inconsistent and frustrating. So I wouldn't even put them in your league. If you're desperate for attention, you can for the kicker, you can do your standard 3 points for field goals 30 yards or less, 4 points for 31 to 40, 5 points for 41 to 50. Not going to get any extra points, so kickers won't be as relevant in this league anyway, even if you choose to use them. But personally, I don't like them. I would just say take them out. So let's talk playoff settings real quick as well. So this is where I'm really contending that the 6-team playoff system would be better than a 4-team, because if you have 6 teams, you can actually run your playoffs in one of 3 ways. Gives you a bit more customization. First way would be you can just play, because there's 10 weeks in the regular season, and considering that half of the teams make it, I don't really foresee there being, and just considering the league is trying to promote fans to be engaged, I don't see any players resting their starters towards the end of the season. So you can play up through week 10, unlike in the NFL where you want to stop early. But considering if you have 6 teams, you can kind of do it one of 3 ways. The first way would be play 9 weeks regular season, then you take the 2 best teams and you have the championship in week 10. That makes it really hard to make the playoffs, so it gives, a lot of incentive to have to do well each week. That might be a little too restrictive. The other way you could do it would be run it through 8 weeks, and then week 9 and 10 you have a 4-team playoff system where you have like a single round elimination, get down to the championship in week 10. The way that I'd really like to do it, we'll see if we actually have the customization options, but the way that makes the most sense to me would be if you have 6 teams, you have 3 teams that make the playoffs. So you play weeks 1 through 8, and then you take your top 3 teams. In week 9, team 1 would actually get the week off. They would get a bye week, so that would be a reward for being the best team in the league. And then teams 2 and 3 would play each other in week 9. Whoever wins that game would then play team number 1 in week 10 for the championship. To me, that's the most ideal setup. Again, we'll see if the fantasy platforms that they release have the customization options for that, or if you guys end up like running your own league using like a Discord server or something like that. That would be the settings that I would push you towards, because it encourages more teams to make the playoffs. So you have 50% of the teams making the playoffs, which is your standard. In 12-team leagues, you typically have 6 teams making it. And that just makes it a little more interesting towards the end of the year. It also rewards the top team with a bye week, which I would imagine in this league there's going to be a lot of volatility. So having that bye week is going to be super helpful, knowing that if you've locked it down, you get automatically bought into the fantasy championship. So again, that's the way that I would push you guys to do it. For 4 teams, again, this is kind of really my main flaw with the 4 teams, is you're pretty much forced into having to do the championship game just be between the 2 top teams. There's no point in having a playoff system if every team makes it, because then what's the point in playing the regular season? So you really want to make sure that you'd only be able to do a playoff system with 4 teams if you had 2 teams making the championship and the other 2 teams not making it. But then especially too with having 10 weeks, if you only have 4 teams, that means every 3 weeks you're going to play the same team twice. So you'd play everyone 3 times. I feel like that would get boring pretty quickly. So again, that's why I'm pushing you more towards a 6-team league versus a 4-team league. But anyway, we have a website set up for you guys so that way you can access rankings for these fantasy leagues. We have pre-draft rankings already set up for you guys. You either click the link in the description below or go to www.fantasyaddictionnetwork.com. You can download those rankings for absolutely free. No charge there. Make sure you guys use those to give you guys a little bit of an advantage if you do choose to play XFL fantasy football. We'll be updating those all throughout this current off-season period leading up into the season. So check back regularly for updates. We'll be posting the updates live as they happen onto that website. So if you guys do decide to play XFL fantasy football, you already have a cheat sheet ready for you. Again, these are set up designed for PPR. Obviously, if you decide to do a standard league where you don't get receptions, that just increases the power runners a little bit more. But really in this league, I think there's going to be a lot of passing even to the running backs. So even if it's not PPR, the pass catching running backs are still going to have a lot more juice in this league than you would see even in the NFL. So it doesn't really change too much no matter what your league settings are. So use those rankings, help you guys crush the league that you guys are in. And I hope you guys enjoy this. We'll be posting tons of content around the XFL throughout this off season. Gives us a little break from the NFL until we get back into it and getting ready for the fantasy season in the NFL. But anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe for more content, and we will see you in the next video.